Politics is theater, then and now, and Washington was a natural-born actor. His dramatic flair had been perfected on the military stage. He loved to go to the theater, and he was a marvelous actor. You know, Ronald Reagan was not our first actor president. George Washington was. There's a wonderful scene after the Revolution when there's a near mutiny by the Continental Army. They haven't been paid by Congress. And Washington is summoned to this mutinous, group of soldiers who are prepared to march on Philadelphia to get their own way. And it's extraordinary. He talks to them, he sympathizes with them, he assures them that he will do everything he can to correct this situation. And then for evidence, he reaches into his pocket, he pulls out a letter from a member of Congress. And very theatrically, he sort of fumbles with this. And then he removes his glasses and he begs the pardon of his audience. And he apologizes. He said, I've already grown old in the service of my country. I'm now growing blind. Well, you can imagine, the reaction instantly, the rebellion kind of, it's like the souffle falls. And the irony is he'd been wearing glasses for years. But, offered magic, who insists on logic? And Washington gave them this amazing theatrical moment. Again, if he hadn't done that, if he hadn't had those instincts, if he hadn't had those skills, who knows? The Army might have marched on Philadelphia. We'd be a very different country today. As president, he traveled extensively in tours that are every bit as choreographed as a presidential visit today. He would ride 40 or 50 miles in a coach. And when he came to the outskirts of a town, and there weren't many towns, remember the largest city in the United States, Philadelphia, had fewer than 40,000 people. There were only 5 places in America with more than 10,000 people. But in any event, when he would come to the outskirts of a town, the routine would unfold. He would get out of his carriage, he would get on this enormous white Charger called Prescott and ride into town. And, people never forgot it. Remember, this is a time when most Americans lived and died within 25 miles of where they were born. No television, no internet, no YouTube. This was theater. And it created him. And Washington understood. He understood that his role as the first president was not only to see, but even more to be seen. He made this experiment tangible. He personalized the government. By the way, no spontaneous speeches. Even the most innocuous words of greeting had to be vetted the day before he arrived. Some things, again, haven't changed. A century before Teddy Roosevelt invented the bully pulpit, Washington was preaching the virtues of religious tolerance. In Newport, Rhode Island, he visited a synagogue. His response to the congregation's greeting remains a classic expression of American pluralism. Quote, "All possess alike liberty of conscience and immunities of citizenship. For happily, the government of the United States, which gives to bigotry no sanction, to persecution no assistance, requires only that they who live under its protection should demean themselves as good citizens." A republic of virtue, he was suggesting, would guarantee nothing less. In 1790, the government pulled up stakes. It left New York. For 10 years, it moved to Philadelphia as a way station before going down to the Potomac and the city not known as Washingtonopolis. It was amazing how much could be done, Washington told visitors, if one was always doing. Thus, he found time to visit his Philadelphia stables every morning and still complete a few hours of paperwork before breakfast at 8. Breakfast at 190 Market Street was a Spartan business. 2 small platters of sliced tongue sat on the table next to some dry toast, bread and butter, quote, "but no broiled fish, as is the general custom," recalled one visitor. "There was but little appearance of form. One servant only attended, who had no livery. A silver urn for hot water was the only article of expense on the table." The president buttered his own corn cakes. Mrs. Washington poured tea and coffee. After breakfast, the president pitched into his steward's account book, reviewing the previous day's household expenditures. On learning that a young relation by marriage had drained 56 bottles of wine in entertaining visitors to Mount Vernon, Washington enjoined a less spacious hospitality, telling his manager that there were but 3 classes of people who deserved fine Madeira. First, quote, my particular and intimate acquaintances. Secondly, some of the most respectable, underline respectable foreigners. I don't know what the non-respectable foreigners got. And thirdly, to persons of some distinction, such as members of Congress, who may be traveling through the country. His accounts in order, Washington called in his secretary for a look at overnight correspondence. Now, it's hard to imagine in this era, remember what this year's federal budget is? Anyone take a stab? I mean, you're paying for it. You ought to know. $2.7 trillion. George Washington employed more people at Mount Vernon than he did in the entire executive branch of government. The first federal budget was around $2 million. The United States Army numbered 600 men. At the State Department, Jefferson found a toy bureaucracy of 5 clerks, spending $8,000 a year. The Constitution says nothing about a cabinet. Washington established it on his own initiative as a sort of privy council. Quote, that there is a diversity of interest in the Union, no one has denied, he told a friend who had warned of regional animosities. He moved aggressively to knit the sections together. Remember, the United States in 1790 is 3 countries. There's New England, there are the Middle Atlantic states, and there's the South. The South is Georgia, South Carolina, North Carolina, Virginia. He organized, in effect, a coalition government around a cabinet made up of men from Massachusetts, New York, and Virginia. Next to geography and philosophy, personal ability governed his appointments. Old soldiers received little special consideration. The president's kin, none at all. And if there's any consolation to subsequent presidents, including the incumbent, not even the father of his country got his way on everything. On one memorable occasion, the Senate rejected his nomination of John Rutledge of South Carolina to be Chief Justice of the Supreme Court on the grounds of insanity. Apparently, the only thing really that was insane about John Rutledge was he had alienated the Senate of the United States. Another precedent. Inevitably, Washington's cabinet became an arena of conflict, its protagonists stock figures or stick figures in later history books, led by Jefferson, the aristocrat who lived on a mountaintop and considered himself a friend to man, versus Hamilton, the self-made elitist with a Calvinist belief in original sin and no shortage of personal experience to back it up. Taking note of Hamilton's reputation as a ladies' man, Martha Washington gave his name to the house pet, a large-headed, extremely amorous tomcat. I love that story. We don't know what Hamilton thought about that, but like fire and frost, Hamilton and Jefferson were temperamental opposites whom not even Washington could reconcile. 2 centuries before Bill Clinton and his aggressive young campaign team declared, "It's the economy, stupid," Washington reserved to put his country's credit on a sound basis. "I think I see a path as clear and direct as a ray of light," he wrote, "which, if pursued, will ensure permanent felicity to the Commonwealth." Here was a coded endorsement of the Hamiltonian program, combining a strong central government with a unified financial structure topped by a presidential cult of personality bordering on adulation. Hamilton, in fact, wanted, as Secretary of the Treasury, to put Washington's profile on the nation's coinage, an idea that was rejected by the House of Representatives as incompatible with Republican virtue. Not until he died did that happen. There was no formally organized opposition party at the outset, but there was no shortage of anti-federalists whose earliest suspicions of the Constitution were confirmed by Hamilton's seeming disregard for the rights of states and the interests of farmers, whom Jefferson called God's chosen people.